So NCAA basketball tournament activity is going to heat up here, like lickety-split. And that puts offices in a kind of a tough spot, or workplaces in a tough spot, depending on the type of work especially. Do you not allow employees to kind of do the office pool and follow that thing pretty closely? Or do you say, no, sure, go right ahead. Make it part of the work environment? Because you may be adversely affecting morale, which then reduces productivity, right? So we are joined here by Jim Whidden, who is the author of The Old School Advantage, Timeless Tools for Every Generation, and he also spends a lot of his time in workshops where he teaches how to get millennials, Generation Xers, and baby boomers to all work together better. Good evening and welcome.
Yeah, hi, Liz. Great to be with you.
This field that you're in has really kind of taken off here in the last 5-7 years, hasn't it?
Well, there's no question. The millennials are getting older and moving into the workforce, so there's a need. We live in a rectangle-dominated, kind of distracted society, and we all need a little help from those distractions, and so I'm trying to offer that.
So how would you say that when it comes to a business owner or a manager sizing up whether or not it's a good idea to really embrace the whole idea of running an NCAA tournament pool in the workplace, what would you suggest, or what are some key questions that, people should be asking themselves?
Well, I think generally we have all become a little shallower in our relationships because of, like I mentioned, the distractions of the electronics. And what I see the NCAA tournament doing is kind of bringing people back to the water cooler, as it were. I don't know if you remember this, but I can remember the days when there were only 3 television stations, believe it or not.
No, I can remember those days.
Yeah. And, the last episode of MASH, and everybody watched it, and then you came to work and talked about it.
Yeah.
Maybe the Super Bowl does that for us now, because if they don't watch the game, they like to watch the commercials, and when you come to work the next day and talk about it. So there's just so few of those common interactions in our society today with the diversity of channels and the internet and that kind of thing, that I think it really gives an employer or any organization a chance to kind of embrace it and maybe bring some people together for some connecting.
Yeah, I didn't even think about it from that aspect because, everybody's into team building these days and building trust and all of that stuff. And, here's a way to kind of secretly do it.
Yeah, and people, especially the millennial generation, so I always say I own 4 of them, but I don't really own them, but I've raised 4 of them. They're about purpose, like our generation was. They're no different. In fact, I've been impressed that maybe they're a little bit more about being part of something larger than themselves than some previous generations. So as silly as it sounds, if you're working together towards a greater purpose, why not also take a little bit of time to enjoy each other and play together, as it were, as you're involved in that greater purpose? And again, I think the NCAA tournament, with numerous brackets and the technology that's available, it makes it easy to do it, number one. So it's user-friendly with the tools we have online now. And it just makes it a lot of fun. Even people that aren't big basketball fans can, do the old mascot choice or something.
Sure. And maybe the millennials can show some of the boomers that have these smartphones but really don't know half of the capability of what their phone is really capable of. Maybe you learn a few things about what your phone could do when it comes to tracking and following some of this stuff.
Yeah, that's true. You mentioned the boomers. I think another thing it does is it brings together anybody that's ever been involved in team sports, and I mean either as a player, a coach, even a fan. Every generation in America has dealt with or been involved with team sports to some degree, or at least they're aware of them because we've got so many of them. Baseball, football, basketball, hockey, soccer, it goes on and on. And so, again, you have this commonality. You have an experience that you can talk about, and it brings that kind of into focus. And it also doesn't hurt to have kind of an atmosphere of competition. If you're selling anything, if you're trying to make a profit, you better be selling either a service or a product. It doesn't hurt to get the old juices flowing, kind of take you back to your old days of when you were on a team or you were a fan of a team or whatever. Kind of get that going, and again, it brings the generations together and kind of bridge that gap, and also maybe just get everybody fired up a little bit to do some things for the company as well. So,
what would you say are, based on, and I'm looking more at kind of your work in the workshops where, you've got companies that have a pretty diverse population of workers, where you've got millennials and you've got Gen Xers and you've got boomers. How do you get them to all start to work better together as a team? What have you discovered over the decade here, or almost the last 10 years, that seems to help things?
Well, as I mentioned in my book, thank you for mentioning it earlier, The Old School Advantage, the idea is that there are certain principles that are called old school because they've lasted literally for millennia, centuries, millennia. For example, argumentation. We think of arguing as bickering today because you see political arguments and even arguments about teams, sports and things, whatever it is. We just don't know how to argue anymore. Well, the Greeks taught us how to argue, Aristotle and Socrates and those philosophers. And so part of it is just sitting folks down, regardless of their age or regardless of their difference in age, and say, let's talk about what's important in having a discussion, especially about something that maybe you don't fully agree upon. And let's listen, and let's learn how to ask great questions, and instead of making declarations, those kinds of things. So if you go back to the basic principles that, again, we call them old school, then you can have a commonality of methods of communicating, because a lot of what we do is in the area of interpersonal communication. And those things don't go away. In other words, the way to argue in a classical sense is not ever going to change. You see what I'm saying? Now, we may not do it as well as we used to, maybe 50 years ago in this country, because we've gotten lazy, or there's just more rancor, or, there's many, we could talk about the various reasons.
Well, there's so many easily accessible sources that will reconfirm our existing belief structure that may not be soundly based in science.
Exactly, and that's why great questions. I mean, people know you. They know how much you know by the questions you ask, not by the statements you make. And then listening. I mean, Grandma said, hey, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. You need to be slow to speak and quick to hear, and that would solve a lot of problems right there.
For sure.
We all get ourselves in trouble doing the opposite of that, right? So it's about just going back to those fundamentals. Vince Lombardi famously held up a football and said, this is a football. What he was trying to say there is, let's get back to the fundamentals. And interestingly, he had just gone to the championship game the season before, and on the first day of training camp, he held that football up and made that statement. So even champions or near champions, in fact, he won, I think, 4 or 5 championships after that little famous speech. So it's about the fundamentals. And so if we don't go back to the fundamentals, then we'll keep making the same mistakes. But it's so easy to go back, and that's why it's a shame when we don't.
Sure. Is there any one trend or hot button thing that you've kind of been dealing with just in the last couple of months in your work as you go around and run workshops that, help millennials and Gen Xers and boomers in the workplace kind of get the most out of their time and activity together?
I think it's in the area of language, of words. We need to scrub our vocabularies, and you know the words I'm talking about. So and like and awesome. These are words that are so overused that people don't even hear them anymore. The word awesome doesn't really mean awesome anymore because it's so overused. So we're working on trying to scrub vocabularies in every generation, and then bring them up to a more sophisticated level, where you sound a little more intelligent. I mean, instead of using awesome, you could certainly use the word exceptional or extraordinary. And that's almost arresting when you're in a conversation and people are expecting you to say awesome.
Yes.
And you say extraordinary, and they kind of stop and look at you like, what? Or how about this simple phrase, first things first? Well, by saying that or starting out a conversation like that, you're saying I'm organized, I'm a sequential thinker, I don't get ahead of myself. I mean, there's so many things that you can communicate in just a few words or phrases. In Chapter 2 of my book, we talk about words that wow. In other words, we want people walking away from conversations or clients or customers walking away saying, wow. I don't know what it is about that young lady or that young man, but they have the it factor and I like them, you know. And really all they've done is just pay attention to the words they're using and learn a few words and phrases that ramp up the quality of their conversation.
Interesting. Well, we certainly appreciate the time that you've carved out here for us this evening and encourage folks to maybe check out The Old School Advantage, Timeless Tools for Every Generation. Thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Miss, and good luck in the bracket.
Exactly. I'm still doing the last couple second tweaks here. Jim Whidden, our guest here on WCCO.